We were talking about gear. What I first started to use for gear when I first started really getting my sound together when I started my own band, the Tone Controls back in the day. Right when I got out of college and I moved back home to Milwaukee, started gigging around with this band, the Susan Julian Band. I had this friend of mine named Ron Garrett who I'd end up playing with about a year later in a band called Drive South. He was from Texas, grew up in Texas, knew all these guitar slingers down there. And he was always telling me about these amps that these guys used down in Texas. And one of the amps that he kept on talking about was this Jim Kelly amp. And I didn't really grow up around a bunch of gear hounds, so I didn't have older siblings that were into it or anything, or neighborhood guys were just, it was the usual kind of fare. It wasn't any like hardcore gearheads. So, but I remember that name, Jim Kelly amp. He's like, man, this Jim Kelly amp is the greatest sounding amp. So I was in a music store one day, Uncle Bob's Music Store, beautiful Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I walked in and I looked, and there on the floor with a cover, a slip cover on it, was a Jim Kelly amplifier. So I said, what's the deal with this amplifier? Oh, there's a studio in town, Midwest Recorders. They're getting rid of all their amps, and one of the amps they had in there was this Jim Kelly amp. I said, well, how much do you want for that thing? They said, I don't know, $400. So I bought the amp sight unseen. I mean, sound unheard, I should say, because I'd heard that these were the shizzle, right? So I buy this amp, and this becomes my main amp for a good couple years, which in that period of time seemed like an eternity. And what I loved about it was like a double deluxe. It was a 2-channel one. It was the FACS, I think they called it. And it was like 2 deluxe reverbs in one amp. So the first channel had a volume, treble and a bass, and there were some push-pull options that did this, that, and the next thing. But the second channel had an attenuator for it. So you could run the volume hot, so you're like really overdriving the power amp section, and then use the power soak to turn it down. So you had the clean sound of the first channel of a deluxe on, I don't know, not very up high. So it was just starting to give a little bit nice and clean and sparkly. And then you go over to the second channel, and that thing sounded like it was ready to explode. And it was had great reverb. It sounded glorious. And at that whole year I was using, when I played in her band, I played at ES335. But I started to get a Jones for playing a Fender again. So during that cusp, I was trying to wean myself off humbuckers, if you know what I'm saying. When you're used to the sound of humbuckers and you're trying to get used to single coils again, man, it's a dicey proposition, or at least it used to be in my mind. So I remember I constructed a Telecaster. I had an American standard Telecaster that I bought from this music store that I was working at called Casio Music in beautiful New Berlin, Wisconsin. I got an American standard Telecaster, and in the neck position I put a humbucker, because that was my thing with 335s. I was on the neck pickup almost all the time because I was very much influenced by Dickie Betts and Danny Toller in that era of the Allman Brothers from like 79 to 82. They mostly played neck pickup tones or middle position. And then as Danny Toller went on to play with the Greg Allman Band and that I'm No Angel record, and I love that Just Before the Bullets Fly record. I love that record, and his tones on there were diabolical. A lot of it was neck pickup on a Les Paul. So I very much liked that sound. And the neck pickup on my 335 into that Jim Kelly amp, man, it sounded thick and glorious. So as I was weaning myself off the 335, I still wanted that neck pickup sound. So on my Telecaster, I wanted a neck humbucker. So I ended up getting a Seymour Duncan Stag Mag humbucker for the neck because it was really good when you split the coil. It sounded glorious as a humbucker. It sounded great when you split it, which is not always the case. And then I had a reverse polarity, a reverse wound single coil in the middle. I can't remember. It wasn't a quarter pounder. It was just a regular single coil of some sort. And then I had a broadcaster, Seymour Duncan broadcaster pickup in the back, which really sounded good. But I went through 3 of them because I would leave my guitar out in the car in the cold, and the wax on those things would get frozen and crack, and it would be microphonic in a nanosecond. But that thing sounded diabolical. And I had a 5-way toggle switch in that guitar, and I had a push-pull on the tone control that allowed me to get to split the coil on the neck humbucker. So that was my way of kind of weaning myself off of humbucker land, because I was always on that humbucker for the neck pickup for leads, but I did all my chicken picking and stuff on the bridge pickup. So I was gradually getting to the point where I was going back more to single coil land We were doing a lot of bluesy rock stuff, and certainly a lot of my favorite players, Hendrix and certainly Clapton and Knopfler and Stevie Ray Vaughan and so on and so forth used Strats. So I really wanted to get the Strat sound. So I remember at that time, Fender had reissued. There were 57 reissues and there were 62 reissues, and they did a run of Mary Kay finishes in both those guitars. And I ended up getting I think it was a 63 Strat or 62, I can't remember. But I got the 60s version of the Mary Kay. So it had a rosewood board, transparent, ash body, with gold hardware. And I forced myself to play that guitar. And it took me a while, but I used, I forced myself to play that guitar. And that was my main guitar that I used for that next iteration, that band that I put together with Ron Garrett called Drive South. I used the Jim Kelly with that Strat. And it was during that period of time that I actually entered in there was an article in Guitar Player magazine. It was a Marshall amplifier competition. And it was, the Bluesbreaker amp had just been reissued. And it was this Bluesbreaker guitar showdown. Send in, 60 seconds of your best blues licks to win this contest. And so with that Strat and my Jim Kelly amp, I made, did a instrumental blues with the rhythm section from the Drive South band. And I sent in the tape, and I got a call, and it turned out I think it was from Richie Fliegler, which of course would be my buddy later on at Fender and elsewhere. And they sent me a JTM 45 half stack for winning first prize. They didn't win grand prize. I won first prize. But it was not bad for sending in a tape. They probably narrowed it down to God knows what. But anyway, I got a call, and I won this amplifier. So I started to get the hankering for more speakers than just a single 12, because the Jim Kelly amp was a single 12 JBL. I blew up the Jim Kelly at one point. Something happened, it stopped working, and then when it got working again, it never quite sounded right. It was hard to get good 6V6 tubes at the time. At least for me it was. In my circles that I ran with, I didn't have anybody who had new old stock stuff. So the amp didn't quite sound right. So I ended up trying to use this Marshall, but I wasn't used to using a closed back cabinet situation. So I ended up getting Fender had just come out with the 59 Bassman reissues. It was basically the same amp, but in the combo. I ended up trading to get the Bassman. So I ended up using Bassman amps in the tone controls. That was my first, once the Jim Kelly kind of got fried out, I ended up using Bassmans, and I got one, then I got two, and I would use an Ibanez Tube Screamer, a TS9, in order to get the overdrive, and I used some kind of device to get reverb on there. And that was kind of when I was forging my sound. That was really when it started to come together, kind of the Strat with the Bassmans. And then, you could get super reverbs back then for relatively cheap. And then I went from the Bassmans to super reverbs. So I ended up getting two blackface super reverbs instead of the Bassmans, sold the Bassmans, kept the super reverbs. There was a period of time there where I was using a Blade guitar, Gary Levinson Blade. It was a Strat-oriented thing. The pickups were quieter on it, and it had this three-way little toggle switch that you could get a little bit more juice on. I love that guitar. But I really wanted an old type of Strat, and at that particular point in time, I ended up saving up my money and getting a Fender Custom Shop guitar based on a 56 Strat. And that 56 Strat and the super reverbs with a Tube Screamer was my main sound for a long time. Anyways, those are the introductory lessons, tone quests of a young fledgling Padawan Grisselite. I hope that is informative.